Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for a lively discussion on an important topic. We're really excited to have you here with us. And as always, I hope you and your loved ones are safe and well. This evening, we will be discussing an issue that is very near and dear to many of our hearts, and that issue is gun violence. It's the number one cause of death for children and teens in our country. It's been so bad that this past March was the first time in 18 years we went without a school shooting in the country for that month. This is truly a pandemic that we are facing. So tonight, it is my honor to have one of my esteemed colleagues with us to discuss this particular issue with us. And we will also be joined by others in our community who have dedicated their life to fighting this pandemic and keeping all of us safe and sound. My colleague, Representative Mike Thompson from California's 5th District, Sasha Cotton from the city of Minneapolis, Ayolanda Evans with Protect Minnesota, and Bunny Peaks with Everytown and Be the Voice. I will now introduce these wonderful guests and let them say a few words about their work on this important issue. First, we will start with Representative Thompson. Thank you so much, Congressman, for joining us.
Well, Congresswoman Omar, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be with you and an honor to be with you. As you mentioned, I'm the chairman of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force in the House of Representatives. I've been in this position since the terrible tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And we worked real hard to bring about gun violence prevention. And as probably everyone on this call knows, when we had a House that was run by the Republican Party, they would not allow us to have a hearing on any of the bills. They would not allow us to have a vote on any of the bills. And for 7 years, they just sat on it. And once we won the majority in this Congress, with your help, Congresswoman, we were able to bring my bill to expand background checks to the floor of the House for a vote. It was the first time in over 25 years that the House of Representatives passed a gun violence prevention piece of legislation. And it's legislation that will save lives. We know it will save lives. And every bit of data shows that, and the American people know it. Over 90% of the American people support expanding background checks. And I want to thank you for your co-sponsorship of that bill. And I want to thank you for voting for that bill and helping us get to the critical mass to get it passed and get it over to the Senate. Now the trick is to get Mitch McConnell to do his job and to pass it in the Senate so it can be signed into law and start saving lives. Background checks are incredibly important in regard to saving lives. Every year, background checks, or every day, background checks stop more than 170 felons from buying a gun and over 50 domestic abusers from buying a gun. And that's only where, in the areas where background checks are the law. The federal law says that you have to pass a background check before you can buy a gun from a federally licensed dealer. So if you're not a federally licensed dealer, or you're not operating in a state that has its own background check requirements, then you can buy a gun willy-nilly without a background check. And we know that background checks are the first line of defense in stopping criminals and people who are mentally incapable of owning a firearm from getting them. So it's a bill we've got to pass. Again, thank you. And I look forward to talking about these issues tonight on your town hall.
It's wonderful to be part of your caucus and to have now had the opportunity to work with you on this piece of legislation. I have 3 school children. My daughter, the oldest, Isra, is 17. My son Adnan is 14, and our youngest Alwad is 8 years old. And I remember when I was in the Minnesota House, Isra leading a delegation of young children to come and talk to us about how important it was for us at the State House to work on gun violence. And I remember telling her that I was incredibly saddened by the fact that I was her age when, a little younger than her when Columbine happened. And I wish that my generation was as active as her generation has been in fighting this issue. Maybe we would have seen a faster movement if we were as active. And so it's been really incredible to watch not just young people advocating for this, but so many other folks in our communities bringing it to the forefront, because it is not just school children that are impacted by gun violence. It's every single person in our community. And now we have Sasha, who I had the incredible honor of working with when I used to work at City Hall. Sasha, how are you?
I'm well, Congresswoman, and thank you so much for the invitation. Really glad to be here with you tonight. We are obviously facing some real challenges in Minneapolis, but we feel optimistic about the work that we're doing and the contribution that it can make to gun violence. As you mentioned, I'm Sasha Cotton, the director of the Office of Violence Prevention in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is the only city in Minnesota to have an Office of Violence Prevention, where we are linearly looking at the issue of violence, particularly the issue of gun violence, and trying to interrupt the patterns that make people vulnerable to such violence. So we are looking at a public health approach, which is not to the exclusion of other theories like law enforcement and reentry, but really tries to look across intervention, prevention, reentry, and enforcement as strategies that we can tap into to address the gun violence epidemic that's happening in our country. As you mentioned, it is truly an epidemic that is affecting everyone in our country, but unfortunately, we know that some are more vulnerable to violence because of risk factors that they face, like poverty and poor access to educational opportunities and unemployment. And the COVID pandemic has only made those circumstances worse. So we are working feverishly on the ground in Minneapolis to build up programs that exist, like our group violence intervention, which works specifically with gang and group members, like our hospital-based work, which is doing bedside interventions with people who have been shot or otherwise injured from violence, and like the new model that we're developing that is an interrupter model that's really designed to get right to the boots on the ground issues where people are in retaliatory fights around gun violence that make them vulnerable to being victims of shootings, and interrupting those conflicts and feuds and trying to get to the heart of the matter, in addition to trying to provide wraparound services, because we know that service provision can really lead to different outcomes when it comes to public safety. So we are invested in creating happy, healthy, and hopeful communities here in Minneapolis. And thank you so much for the invitation and opportunity to talk about these really important matters tonight.
Thank you, Sasha. I know that for a while now, we've been talking about gun violence prevention as a public health issue. And, it's incredible that Minneapolis is leading the effort in that. And I really do appreciate everything you all are doing there. Ayolanda, can you please introduce yourself? Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's such an honor to be here and to really talk about this subject and bring it to the people. My name is Ayolanda Evans-Mack. I am the Director of Partnerships for Safe Communities with Protect Minnesota. Protect Minnesota is the only state-specific, state-based gun violence prevention organization in the state of Minnesota. We work on policy and legislation that has an impact on violence. Our whole goal is to reduce incidences of gun violence and unintended access to firearms. We're not anti-gun. We believe in gun ownership. We believe in the Second Amendment. And at the same time, we also believe in sensible gun laws that have an impact, especially in spaces where those people are, disproportionately impacted by gun violence. So part of my work is really around joining and building partnerships and coalitions within Black and Brown communities to really ground a grassroots response to hyper-localized gun violence that we see with the interpersonal gun violence. A lot of my work is in North Minneapolis, and I'm currently working on a documentary that really examines what's happening on the ground. Who are the boots on the ground people? What is the community response? What are we already doing? And how can policy really support the boots on the ground? So we're looking at, does the community already have solutions? Or does the community need solutions? Do we need more research, or is there already enough information out there? And how can we partner with our decision makers and our policy makers to support what's already happening in the community, and to just take that work further so we can see a reduction in violence in general, and then more specifically, violence with guns.
Thank you so much. And I think it's an important piece to remind folks, right, that we're not, when we talk about sensible gun laws, first, we're not anti-gun. And second, that it's not only mass shootings, which people have made the conversation about sensible gun laws synonymous with, but it's about community violence prevention. It's about preventing suicides. It's about preventing, violence within domestic cases. And it's an issue that touches our lives in every single aspect. And it's not only, preventing a madman with a gun, but it's about preventing everyone who can utilize a weapon to endanger and take the lives of our community members. Bunny, thank you so much for joining us. We'll get into it a little bit, your story, but first, can you just chime in and introduce yourself so that our audience can get to know you?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman Omar and Representative Thompson. As you mentioned, I'm Bunny Beeks. I am a 2020 Fellow of Everytown's and Moms Demand Action Survivors Fellow. I am a prior board member for Protect Minnesota. I also sit on the panel with the Group Violence Intervention along with Sasha Cotton. And I recently started my own organization called Be the Voice. And so I am very happy to be here today to discuss these matters because I have been personally affected by gun violence. And I think that it's important that we speak out about it and do something about it. And so in particular, Sasha has already described the Group Violence Intervention Project, and Yolanda has done a great job in describing what Protect Minnesota does. Me starting Be the Voice is a support system and advocacy group for families and friends of victims who have been lost to gun violence in Minneapolis. And in doing so, we just want to be that support, in such a tragic time. And we know that happens way too often. And I know firsthand that pain that comes along with that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think many of us, who live in Minnesota's Fifth have probably either experienced it ourselves or probably know somebody who has experienced gun violence that hits closer to home. And so I really appreciate your perspective and your ability to join us tonight. But I want to start with Representative Thompson. You have been a champion of gun violence prevention for many years, and you finally saw the passage of a major reforms when the House passed H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112 last year. What was it about this Congress and this moment you think that helped accomplish that victory? Because oftentimes people, who don't follow the ways in which legislation is introduced, how these issues are brought to the forefront, and what brings about a moment that makes it possible. So if you can just sort of give us an overview of what was it that made you decide, even though the 90% of the country wasn't with you at that time, and many members of Congress might not have been with you, to say, we need to introduce these pieces of legislation. We need to start this caucus. This is an important conversation for us to have. What got you there?
Well, thank you. As I'm like you guys, I am not anti-gun either. I'm pro-gun. As a matter of fact, I'm a gun owner. I've owned guns most of my life. I'm a hunter. I carried an assault weapon for a tour of duty in Vietnam, where I was wounded in combat. So I have pretty extensive experience in the gun lane. And as I mentioned, I became really involved after the tragedy at Sandy Hook. And the irony was, when Sandy Hook happened, I was duck hunting. I was in a duck blind. I got the news on my device, a BlackBerry at the time. And on the way back, I called then leader Pelosi, and she told me that she had some conversations with different members, and that she was getting pushback in regard to doing anything about it. And she mentioned one member in particular who really gave her a bad time. And I said, listen, I know as much about guns as anybody else, and I disagree. I think we do need to do something. And if I can help, let me know. And the next Tuesday in caucus, she announced that she was putting together the task force and that I was going to chair it. So that's how that all came down. We did a lot of work. We went out, we invited everybody who could remotely be considered a stakeholder in the gun debate to the table, trying to get information. We brought experts in from every side of the issue. And we've determined that the best thing that we could do, the quickest thing, the thing that would save the most lives, would be to expand background checks, to make sure that anybody who buys a gun has to go through a background check, find out if they're a criminal, find out if they're a danger to themselves or to others. And as I mentioned earlier, we know it works. It works really well. And that was the bedrock issue in our effort. And as I mentioned, for 7 years, we couldn't get a hearing on it. We couldn't get a vote on it. At one point, frustration was so high that our former colleague, God rest his soul, John Lewis, led a sit down in the well of the Congress, and we shut the Congress down for, I think it was 28 hours, where we took over the floor. But still, the Republicans wouldn't budge. And you're right, we passed it this year. We passed it this year because we changed the majority in the House. With Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, she made it a priority. As you know, Congresswoman, the Speaker has the first 10 numbers in bill assignments. HR 1 through HR 10 are the Speaker's top priority. I believe I could have had HR 1 on that bill, but we specifically asked for HR 8 because it was the 8th year anniversary of our former colleague, Gabby Gifford, from being shot. So we asked for that. We were given that bill number. And on the 8th day of January, that bill was introduced on the floor of the House. As a matter of fact, Gabby Gifford was with me. She walked down the main aisle in the House with me, and we together dropped that bill in the hopper. The Speaker and the chair of the Judiciary Committee worked with me so we could get a hearing set. We had a hearing on the bill. It was a all day hearing. Everybody got every opportunity to ask any questions. I think they debated 1 million amendments to the bill, and it was passed out of the committee and then passed off the floor into the Senate. You also mentioned the Charleston loophole bill that we also passed, and that too was an important bill. If you recall, there were a number of parishioners who were murdered in a church in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And the reason that the shooter was able to get the gun is because there was a glitch in the law that they missed him being a problem, and they didn't have enough time to do a thorough check. The law says after 3 days, if you can't determine that someone is prohibited from buying a gun, unless there's a state law that says otherwise, you have to give them the gun. And that's what happened in South Carolina. So Jim Clyburn had legislation that closes that loophole, extends the period of time so those doing the background checks will have ample time to make sure that they search thoroughly all of the records to ensure that someone who should be prohibited doesn't get their hands on a gun. And so that's what turned it. The American people were with us. Everybody was with us except the House Republicans. And as soon as we changed that, we were able to pass the bill and get it over to the Senate.
Well, thank you so much for your commitment to that. I know that sometimes having ideas that you feel like you're going to face resistance from those who are capable of pushing it through makes it really hard. And it's because you believed in it that it's allowed for us to come along to help you pass it.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I remember when the bill passed, a lot of us, you probably remember this, Congressman Thompson, we went to go take these historic pictures in the front lawn to commemorate many of the constituent stories we all shared on the floor on why this important was an important, why this bill was an important bill in regards to the constituencies that we served. And I had the honor of sharing Bonnie's story when we passed HR 8 in the House. I'm wondering, Bonnie, if you can share your story with our viewers tonight.
Absolutely. So thank you for sharing my mom's story and always being willing to share my mom's story. So in May 2016, my mother, Burdell Beeks, and my then 16-year-old daughter were driving down the street in North Minneapolis, just waiting at a stop sign, something that we all do on a regular basis. Driving in a residential area. My daughter happens to look up and sees that there is a person standing with a gun pointed in their direction on the opposite side of the street of them. She immediately yelled at my mom to duck as she seen him pull his gun up to begin to fire. And unfortunately, my mom did not duck in time. She was hit by one of the assailant's bullets in her arm. The bullet traveled to her heart and ultimately killed her. Unfortunately, my daughter witnessed her grandmother saying her last words, which were, "Baby, they got me." And ever since that time, I have fought tirelessly to help other families and other victims of gun violence in Minneapolis. Through being an advocate, being a support system for them, speaking to the men through the group violence intervention, just saying to them, there's a better way at life, in hopes that some of this can counter the violence that we see on the streets in Minneapolis.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And again, just I share my condolences to your loss. I know how hard it can be to unearth this story for you and your family every single day, and to feel re-traumatized about that particular loss. So I really do appreciate you sharing that. I know that when this bill was actually, a similar bill was being debated in the Minnesota House, we were in the minority, and we also ran into many challenges, and did have one of our colleagues, Erin May Quaid, who represented Apple Valley. She did a 24-hour sit-in, and we all joined her and shared stories of so many community members who have fallen victim to gun violence. So Yolanda Evans, I'm wondering if you can help us understand how we can change our community investment strategy and our economic security to help counter violence. I know that there are, many programs right now that are functioning, that many of you have spoken about, to prevent violence in our communities. But as Sasha had spoken to, even with the understanding that this should be treated as a public health pandemic, that we all now understand how important it is to prevent gun violence. It still doesn't get the resources it needs when we're doing our budgeting, whether it is on a municipal level, state level, or even in Congress. So how can we change that investment strategy and economic security to counter violence?
Thank you, Congresswoman. That is a great question. I believe that oftentimes the community knows what the community needs. There are so many organizations, so many boots on the ground, individuals that aren't even attached to organizations. Sometimes they're the parents who live on the corner who just want to make sure that children have a safe place to go, that their children's friends have a safe place to go. So they open up their home, they make sure that they have food, they nurture them. And so you hit the nail on the head in terms of resources. We have a lot of great initiatives that are under-resourced or defunded. And so it's really important that as we really look towards solutions for gun violence prevention, that it's not just in the hands of philanthropy, but that also state, city, and federal investment in communities most impacted by gun violence. And I really am speaking around the interpersonal violence that we see experienced in communities with concentrated poverty, with concentrated disparities, that we see on a city, state, and federal level, resources poured into those communities to address the root causes of gun violence, which are housing disparities, which are education disparities, which are healthcare disparities, and opportunity gaps. As we talk about, we need safe spaces for children to play. We need spaces for families to learn and to develop and to build family cohesion. We need spaces that can build community cohesion amongst one another. And because the way that things go, we see so much of a divestment in communities that need it the most. And so my suggestion really is that state, city, federal governments partner with philanthropy to have long-term investment and have people who live in these communities at the table, and that have a level of agency and autonomy in terms of finding and building out the strategy that's required. And so we need hyper-localized efforts that look specifically from community to community. And then we have that city layer, and then we have the state layer, and then we have the federal layer that can really support holding it all together. So people, marginalized voices need a space at the table, and that we also need the resources to do the work that we know actually works and drives toward those positive outcomes that we're looking for in our community.
Thank you so much. Now I suppose we can really dig deep in and see ways in which, particular offices can address and work to end this cycle. So, Sasha, your office has been working really hard to break the cycle of violence in addressing it at 3 points. Can you talk about those 3 points and what your office has achieved? And then I think maybe just in asking, what would it mean for more resources to be allocated in the budgeting process for the work that your office is doing in addressing this need that our community has in the way Yolanda has talked about?
Yes, thank you for the question and the opportunity to share a little bit about our work. We have been in existence for just over a year, but the work really predates that by almost a decade. Minneapolis has been doing youth violence prevention work, particularly since 2008 under a public health approach. And what that really means is that we're looking at a 3-tiered approach that looks at what we call primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. And we operate that in a pyramid shape. So there's a base to that pyramid, which is primary prevention. And that is programs and services that get at the root causes of violence. We know that issues related to poverty, education, poor access to employment, mental health issues, chemical dependency, all really contribute to a lack of health in community and a predisposition to negative outcomes, including but not limited to violence. And so if we can focus on what we know works to keep most communities healthy and infuse it into the places where we're seeing an increase in violence, that really helps in the underpinning of making those communities stable and safe. In the secondary prevention, what we really look at are programs that address high-risk needs. So we know that there are signs and symptoms that violence is either happening already or it looks like it's going to happen. Things like a parent who's incarcerated, underlying mental health issues of a parent, growing up in a community where violence is very present, are all indicators that put a person or a community at high risk for issues related to violence. And so we want to design and implement programs that really get at the root of those things as soon as possible. One of the programs that I would highlight that we focus on is an initiative called Inspiring Youth. Myself and my colleague, Josh Peterson, who is the manager of our office, both have previous history working in the juvenile delinquency system. And one of the things we both came to the city with knowledge of was that so many of our young people have to wait until they're adjudicated delinquent, which means basically a juvenile felony charge, before they begin to receive the services that we know are so critical to their development. Things like regular health care, access to mental health, counseling for families, anger mediation services, even housing. Oftentimes, those are things that are out of whack until they're placed on juvenile probation. And so if we can provide those services before they're ever adjudicated delinquent, maybe we can prevent them from going into the prison pipeline. And so our program Inspiring Youth seeks to do that. It provides families with an opportunity to get all of those resources, to get a case manager who's working with that young person who's at high risk and working with that family to stabilize them so that that young person doesn't end up in our juvenile justice system, but can get the plethora of resources that they need. Now, I think all of us can agree that for kids who are in that high risk situation, a program like that seems ideal, particularly before they end up in the courts. What we know right now is that we maintain a waiting list that is exponentially long for that program, and we're only able to serve 75 young people with that program each year due to budgetary restraints. And so it is things like that that we need to expand and increase the capacity to serve, because if we were serving every young person who had those needs, I think we could see great reductions in our juvenile justice docket. The last bucket of work that we focus on in the public health approach is tertiary work. And tertiary work really focuses on the repeat pattern of violence. It interrupts cycles of violence because we know that violence is a retaliatory nature often, that we have almost a human nature to want to vindicate when we've been victimized. That being said, we know that that creates patterns, and that retaliatory violence is really what drives a lot of the gun violence in most major cities. And so if we can get in front of that nature to want to go back and address someone who has hurt you, because we know it is hurt people who hurt people. We know that in most instances, a person who is a victim today could be a perpetrator tomorrow, and vice versa, when we're talking about gun violence in communities. And so working with those people who are most likely to be a victim or a perpetrator of community gun violence is essential to reducing the gun violence in our cities and keeping all of us safe. Because to Bunny's story, we know that bullets do not have names on them. And even though we want to see our young people, who are often the ones doing the shootings, redirect that energy into something positive, it is absolutely essential that we redirect their energy and prevent those shootings, because they put our entire community at risk, which is what ultimately led to the death of Mother Beeks, which was such a tragedy in our community. Bunny continues to have our condolences, and we appreciate her sharing her story with us at the group violence intervention table, because it is always the most meaningful story. Our group violence intervention strategy includes a panel discussion with young men mostly who are greatly at risk of being the next victim or perpetrator of a gun incident. And there are systems players that talk. Our mayor talks, our chief of police talks, our county attorney, our United States attorney, all of these systems players talk. And that's, helpful to set a context of why the gun violence is bad and how it's hurting our community and what the consequences in the legal system can look like for gun involvement. But it is the story of hearing the loss of life of a mother and a grandmother, and how that has uprooted our community and how it has uprooted the Beeks family, that I think really gets to the heart of those young men and often compels them to change their life and take the service provision that we're able to offer them. And that service provision comes directly from people who have previous experience in gangs and groups. And I think sometimes we underestimate the wealth of knowledge that people who have their own personal experiences as being a perpetrator, who have, turned their lives around, potentially many of them have gone to prison, and they come home with a deep-seated interest in wanting to help change the mess that they maybe helped to create. And so we really tap into the power of that. We're careful because we want to find people who are serious, but they have a wealth of knowledge that you and I just can't provide. And so those are some of the strategies that are evidence-based and rooted in research that we're applying here in Minneapolis. There's a number of other ones, but I want to make sure that we get a chance to hear from the rest of our speakers. But check out our website, Google Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention. It's a great way to learn about all the programs the city is offering that are all greatly under-resourced. Our budget represents just $1.7 million of the city's overall budget, which is less than 1% of the overall budget.
Thank you, Sasha. I just had a quick follow-up for you. I know that you talked about a lot of these partnerships, right, with community members. And I know how valuable it is for us not to only center the voices of the survivors and those that are impacted by gun violence, but also to use their expertise, their knowledge, their understanding of their communities, and where the solutions might be in addressing future problems. Are there particular organizations, within the community that you guys partner with that are out there? If you can name any of them, and two, are there specific resources that the city currently allocates to these community partners so that they can help in finding a solution?
Yeah, I would hate to get into naming individual organizations that we partner with, because I would inevitably forget some of them. But there are a number of organizations that are working on the ground every day to address these issues, as well as a number of people and individuals who are really advocating for the needs of communities most impacted. And that's really the way we try to contextualize this, is that victimization and perpetration are deeply linked. And so we want to make sure we're getting to the people who are most impacted, which are people who are both victims and perpetrators of violence. And if we want to truly understand how we work our way out of victimization, we have to talk to the perpetrators. We have to find out what motivates people to perpetrate acts of harm and violence in our community, particularly with guns, because we know that behavior, as awful as it is, and as much as we need to hold those people who make those decisions accountable, those behaviors are often deeply rooted in trauma. And so I would point to services that really focus on addressing those underlying causes of trauma, that work to address community trauma, individual trauma, and the historical trauma that so many of our communities of color are addressing. And so because they're on the line, I will certainly name that we work closely with Yolanda and Protect Minnesota, Bunny, talked about her relationship to us, and I mentioned her work with the group violence intervention. I'm proud to support her new organization, and we are always just looking for ways to build the capacity of those small organizations. And so I will highlight that we offer a program called the Blueprint Approved Institute, which is modeled after our national strategy focused on violence prevention that was built out of Minneapolis, but it is a national model, because we believe that building the capacity of individuals and organizations addressing this work who are closest to these issues really are the ones with the solutions. And so we encourage those on the ground who want to do this work, but want to build the skills to do it well, to reach out to us about the Blueprint Approved Institute.
Thank you. That only account for a small fraction of gun violence in this country? And are there policies that will specifically help counter the everyday violence that's plaguing our homes and streets?
Representative, could you repeat the question? We were having some audio issues.
Is he still with us?
I believe he is, but they might not have been able to hear the question.
I see. Okay. Representative Thompson, what I was saying was that oftentimes we hear gun control policies in response to mass shootings and other events that capture the attention of the news media, but don't these events only account for a small fraction of gun violence in this country? And are there policies that would specifically address the violence that's plaguing our communities every single day?
Well, it's a good point. Generally, the media covers these huge shooting events.
Right.
They're spectacular. They get headlines. Everybody focuses in on that. But the truth of the matter is, 30 people every day are killed by someone using a gun. So this is more than just the big mass shootings. This is an everyday, all-day problem. And we need to recognize that. So that's why, in part, the expansion of background checks is so important. That works to keep guns out of the hands of people that would, in fact, use those in these everyday situations. And as I said before, we know it works. We know that right after Sandy Hook, 2 states took significant actions. The state of Missouri repealed some gun violence prevention laws that they had on the books. So they reduced the amount of gun laws that protect folks. And they saw a big jump of about 25% in gun-related incidents in the state of Missouri. At the same time, Connecticut increased their gun violence prevention laws, and they saw about a 40% drop in gun-related crime in their state. So these are things that we can do that will really make a difference. And I just want to comment on something that 2 of the other speakers had mentioned. And by the way, you've done a great job putting together a panel. I am really impressed by the dedication and the level of sincerity of the other panelists and their commitment on a 24/7 basis for not only reducing gun violence, but for making our communities better. And everybody has alluded to the fact that there are a lot of other things that we can do, from creating housing opportunities to healthcare to funding different programs that really help with these problems. And someone much smarter than me once said, whenever somebody says you can't solve a problem by throwing money at it, they're talking about someone else's problem. Everybody on this panel knows that it takes resources to do the things that we all know need to be done. And gun violence costs us as taxpayers about $230 billion a year. That works out to be about $700 for every taxpayer in the United States of America. Could you imagine if we could turn that money into programs that will help not only on gun violence, but all the different problems that contribute to our violence situation in the country. So this gun violence is a big deal. We can save lives and we can save money.
So, Congressman, it looks like what you are saying is, our ability to not recognize how much this is costing us has made it for us not to push for and campaign for those resources to be utilized in other aspects of what our communities need.
Well, we all know that there's a lot more that we need to invest in. We need to invest in people in the United States of America. And anytime you're spending $230 billion, chasing gun violence perpetrators and dealing with all of the fallout to the family and the hospital bills and the likes, that's all money that we can't spend to turn things around. So I think it's a very relevant issue and one that we ought to talk about. And as I said before, the American people are on our side. The American people know that there are some people who should not be able to get their hands on guns. And the only way that you can find out who they are is if you do a background check. And if we can keep guns away from those people, we can save lives and we can save money.
Bunny and Yolanda, much of the progress really that has been made in regards to dealing with gun safety and preventing gun violence has been driven by grassroots and community organizations in many years. Some would even say that you all have become as powerful, if not more, as the gun lobbyists. Curious, why do you think you're having so much success in getting lawmakers to listen and also changing, I think, the perspective of the public in wanting to address this issue? And what do you think comes next?
You want to take that first?
Okay, yes, thank you. So I would say a grassroots effort that looks at the internal and the external. So the internal is like the base, the foundation, the people that are impacted, making sure, again, that they have a space at the table, that they have a level of autonomy and agency in terms of being able to articulate the issue, and at the same time being able to support the external, which are the policymakers and the decision makers, to know which way to go as it relates to making decisions, writing bills, and really enacting laws that support the community. And so that piece is really important. It has to have the internal and the external component. We have to work in solidarity. Our communities, the gun violence prevention community, that is, has really connected and has really been, to a certain extent, moving in solidarity with one another, because we know that our voice together is so much more strong. When we have a collective agenda that we can all speak to, when we have a collective goal that's identified, that we can work on the internal and the external. And so really looking at those common values and those common goals and moving from there. So what's next? We're going to continue fighting. We're going to, in terms of advocating, in terms of being the voice. Really, what Bunny is doing with the work with Be the Voice is extremely important. Working on the internal, supporting the external to frame the issues that are impacting communities, and being able to work in both spaces at the same time.
And I believe it's a success because basically America's tired. We're tired of seeing the violence. We're tired of seeing it on the news daily. We're tired of reading it in our social media places. And 90% of even gun owners agree with us that there needs to be a solution to the gun violence that's taking place in America. And I think that's why we're being heard now quite loudly. I also believe that voices in the grassroots communities and organizations and recently are loud simply because we're so tired. And we want the violence to end. We know that seeing the shootings in the news and everything plays an impact on all. And we also know that when we see these in the different communities, that there are people that are perpetrators and there are people that are victims. But there are also the people that are without. And all of that is traumatizing within the community in itself. And so because we have both of these, it leads to more victimization and people wanting to, like Sasha had mentioned, that people want to do harm to others because they have been hurt. And we know that hurt people. And so we have to do something about that. It's not going to end. And like Representative Thompson said, we have to put money in it. We have to start at the grassroots. We have to start before these kids are becoming perpetrators. We have to put things like home economics and things back in school, just the very basic of things that have been taken away from children for so long that could help stir them in a better direction. There aren't things for kids to do. In Minneapolis, there are very few programs that are available. So idle hands lead to idle problems. And when you have parents that are working and can't tend to their kids and they're at home raising themselves, all of this plays a part. So we have to do better, especially for our children, because our children are our future. And if our children are killing one another off daily, we don't have a future. So we have to invest in them.
Thank you both. Bunny, I'm curious, I wanted to ask you this question. I survived war as a kid, and that trauma has stayed with me for now 29 years, and it's one of those things that it does just show up and it creeps in on days that I don't even recognize or prepare myself for. And I'm curious, what do you want society to know and engage in supporting survivors of violence, and ways you think that we should be helping instead of to utilize your story to create change is one, right?
Yes.
But what do you and survivors need in order to heal and be made whole?
Well, let me first say, and I'm sure that you know this as well, when you witness things like this or when you've gone through such trauma, it's nothing that you ever get over.
Right.
It's something that you learn to cope with and deal with in a different way. However, just having that person or people around you that can help support you in those times, including just having that shoulder to talk to, that person to be able to pick up the phone to call. That's one of the reasons that I started Be the Voice. There aren't programs that are like that to help those that are left behind, or to even help those that may have been shot that don't have that support either. They need to know that there's a support level that's out there for them. And by providing funding to grassroots organizations, we can help survivors. It has to be, like you said, unfortunately, it's going to cost money, and it's costing money to do, the burial. It's costing money for hospitals and things like that. It's going to cost money to help our communities and to help with the trauma in our communities. And just investing in grassroots, like I said, Again, you never get over the trauma. And kids are traumatized that haven't been directly impacted because they're hearing these shootings every day. So it's like they're in a war zone. And so they, so to say, they're a product of their environment. What is happening in the communities is a product of environment. And because these kids see this, they think that this is the okay standard. And we should not allow it to continue to be the norm, which it has become.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for the opportunity to have this important conversation. Thank you so much, Representative Mike Thompson, for taking the time out and for your tireless advocacy, not just chairing the caucus, but bringing forth this bold legislation so that we are able to now have a conversation beyond moving it from the House to what it means to pass it in the Senate, and then hopefully get a president that will sign it into law.
Well, thank you very much. It was an honor to be with you, and thank you for all your help. And if I could just squeeze in one little word, two of the speakers talked about kids and the impact. You know, every kid in school across the country is fearful of a school shooting that they're going to be a part of. I hear it in my district all the time. Kids say, will my school be the next one? And this has got to take a toll. It takes a toll on a kid being a kid. It affects the way they learn. It's disruptive to their school day and their personal life. And kids are a big part of the solution to this. We saw it in Florida. And, you know, after they had that terrible shooting in Florida, and it was the kids that got the Florida state legislature to pass a bill. And then Governor, now Senator Rick Scott, you know, that guy would never sign any gun violence prevention bill. And he signed that bill before the ink was dry. And it was because there were 300,000 17-year-olds in Florida who were going to be eligible to vote that November. So kids have a lot at stake in this, and these are our student leaders. They are going to be in large part responsible for our success. We shouldn't forget that, and we should work closely with them because it's going to take all of us to get this over the finish line to make our community safe. So thank you all for what you're doing. Congresswoman, thank you for being a great colleague. Thanks for all that you've done to help move gun violence prevention forward. And I look forward to seeing you when we come back to pass this bill to get through COVID.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to our champions for joining us. You know, I think to everyone who's listening, who oftentimes might ask us what we are doing in regards to crime prevention and why we're not talking about those who are losing their lives every single day within our community. We do. These are issues we are focused on. It's not just, you know, the prevention of mass shootings. It's about the prevention of community violence every single day. It's about finding solutions that address the hearts of the problem, whether it is, you know, asking and supporting funding for housing, for educational support, for mental health, for our youth so that they feel supported and cared for, to caring for the victims and their families, to wanting to create an opportunity for real investment to exist in our communities so that we can address the social and economic neglect that often leads to the kind of community violence that we see oftentimes. You know, I always say, as someone who survived war, who left the country I was born in, to now raise children who are afraid in their schools, or to live in a community where my neighbors are having a conversation every single day about surviving gun violence, you know, whether they are going shopping or doing anything in their community, feels such a tragedy to me. And so that's why I invest so much time in having these conversations and working with community partners and advocates and colleagues in addressing this. So thank you all for tuning in and to our marvelous panelists, Sasha, Yolanda, and Bunny. Thank you so much for everything that you do and the incredible investment that you make to make our community safer. Bye, everyone.